The blood on Penelope Dawson's hands had dried 3 hours ago, but she could still feel its phantom stickiness as she urged her exhausted mare through the dusty streets of Dorado, Kansas, her body swaying with each labored step the animal took. She had been running for 372 days, sleeping on hard ground, rocky caves, and once, memorably, in a tree when a pack of wolves had circled below. And the memory of soft cotton sheets and a real mattress had become so distant it felt like something from another woman's life entirely. The year was 1882, and Penelope had learned that survival meant forgetting comfort, forgetting safety, and especially forgetting that she was only 23 years old and should have had a different life than this one of constant flight and fear. The town appeared before her like a mirage in the late afternoon sun. Wooden buildings lined up along a dirt road that ran straight as an arrow through the heart of cattle country. Dorado had grown prosperous from the railroad and the cattle drives that passed through on their way north. And even in her exhausted state, Penelope could see that this was a real town, not just a collection of tents and hastily constructed saloons like so many others she had passed through. Her mare stumbled, and Penelope felt the animal's legs shake beneath her. They had been pushing too hard for too long, and guilt twisted in her chest because this horse had saved her life more times than she could count, and she was running it into the ground. She dismounted carefully, her own legs barely more steady than the mare's, and led the animal toward what appeared to be a livery stable at the edge of town. Every muscle in her body screamed with exhaustion, and the dress she wore, once a respectable blue calico, was now so covered in dust and stains that its original color was nearly impossible to discern. Her dark hair hung in a tangled braid down her back, and she knew without looking that her face was gaunt and sunburned, her green eyes probably wild with the kind of wariness that came from a year of looking over her shoulder. The livery stable was a sturdy structure that smelled of hay and horses and leather, and as Penelope led her mare inside, she heard the sound of someone working in one of the stalls. A man emerged a moment later, and Penelope's hand instinctively moved toward the small pistol hidden in the folds of her skirt before she forced herself to stop. Not everyone was a threat. She had to remember that, even though her body had forgotten how to believe it. The man was tall, perhaps 27 or 28, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of whiskey in sunlight. He wore the typical attire of a working cowboy: worn denim pants, a cotton shirt with the sleeves rolled up to reveal tanned forearms, and a leather vest that had seen better days. His boots were scuffed, his hands calloused, and there was a quiet competence in the way he moved that reminded Penelope of her father, back before everything had gone so terribly wrong. "Help you?" he asked, his voice a low rumble that somehow did not feel threatening despite Penelope's jangled nerves. "My horse needs care," Penelope said, her own voice hoarse from disuse. She had not spoken to another human being in nearly a week. "I can pay." The cowboy's eyes moved from Penelope to the mare, and she saw his expression shift from polite interest to concern. He moved closer to the horse, running his hands along her legs and sides with a gentleness that made something in Penelope's chest tighten unexpectedly. "She is about done in," he said quietly. "When did she last have water and feed?" "This morning," Penelope lied, because it had actually been the previous morning, and she did not want this stranger to know how desperate their flight had been. The cowboy looked at her, and Penelope had the uncomfortable sensation that he could see right through her lie. But he did not call her on it. Instead, he simply nodded and led the mare to a stall, moving with that same careful competence. "I will take care of her," he said. "Name is Matthew Kincaid. I run this place." Penelope, she offered, leaving off her last name because surnames could be traced, could be remembered, could lead the wrong people right to her door. Matthew did not press for more, which Penelope appreciated more than he could possibly know. He filled a bucket with water and let the mare drink slowly, carefully, while he spoke to the animal in a low, soothing voice. Penelope watched, feeling her own throat constrict with thirst, and realized that she had been so focused on the horse that she had not tended to her own needs in far too long. "There is a pump out back," Matthew said without looking up, and Penelope wondered if her desperation was truly that obvious. "Help yourself, and when you are done, come back inside. Your mare is going to need some time before I know if she will be all right." The words were casual, but Penelope heard the underlying meaning. She had pushed this animal too hard, and there was a chance she had damaged it beyond repair. The guilt that had been a constant companion for months now intensified, and she had to blink back tears as she turned and walked out to find the pump. The water was cool and sweet, and Penelope drank until her stomach protested, then splashed it over her face and neck, washing away some of the trail dust that had become like a second skin. She longed for a real bath, for soap and clean clothes and a bed with actual sheets, but those were luxuries she could not afford. Not when staying in one place too long could mean death. Not when the men her uncle had hired were probably still looking for her, still determined to drag her back to Missouri and force her into a marriage that would give her uncle control of the land her parents had left her. She had been 19 when her parents died in the fire, and 22 when she had finally understood that her uncle's kindness was a facade hiding his greed. She had run the night before the forced wedding, had taken her horse and what little money she could grab and disappeared into the darkness. That had been a year ago, and she had been moving ever since, never staying anywhere long enough to leave a trace, never trusting anyone enough to tell them her story. When Penelope returned to the stable, Matthew had finished tending to her mare and was forking fresh hay into the stall. The horse was already eating, which Penelope took as a good sign. Matthew glanced up at her approach, and she saw his eyes register the clean streaks on her face where she had washed away the dust. "She will be all right," he said, answering the question Penelope had not asked. "But she needs rest." Real rest, not just a night or two, a week at minimum, preferably 2. Penelope felt her heart sink. 2 weeks. She had never stayed anywhere for 2 weeks since she had started running. "I cannot," she began, but Matthew held up a hand. "If you ride her out of here in the next few days, she will go lame or worse," he said bluntly. "I know it is not my business why you are running or what you are running from, but killing a good horse because you are scared is not the answer." The words stung because they were true, and because Penelope had been so focused on her own survival that she had stopped thinking clearly about the animal that had carried her all this way. She took a shaky breath, trying to think, trying to calculate risks and possibilities and options when her exhausted mind felt like it was moving through mud. "How much for 2 weeks' board?" she asked finally. Matthew named a price that was more than fair, and Penelope realized with a sinking sensation that she had enough money to cover it. But that would leave her with almost nothing for food or lodging for herself. She must have let her dismay show on her face because Matthew's expression softened slightly. "You got a place to stay?" he asked. "I will find something," Penelope said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. Matthew studied her for a long moment, and Penelope resisted the urge to fidget under his gaze. There was something about this cowboy that made her feel seen in a way she had not been in a very long time, and it was both comforting and terrifying in equal measure. "I've got a small cabin out back of the stable," Matthew said slowly, as if choosing his words carefully. One room, but it has got a real bed and a stove. I have been sleeping there since I took over this place 6 months ago, but I can bed down in the stable. You can use it until your horse is ready to travel. Penelope stared at him, certain she had misheard. You would give up your bed for a stranger. You look like you have not slept in a real bed in a long time, Matthew said simply. And I have slept in worse places than a stable. Consider it part of the boarding fee for your horse. Every instinct Penelope had developed over the past year screamed at her to refuse, to not accept help from a stranger, to not stay in one place long enough for the wrong people to find her. But she was so tired, so desperately tired, and the thought of sleeping in a real bed with a roof overhead that was not a cave or a hollow tree was almost painfully tempting. "Why would you do this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Matthew shrugged, but there was something in his eyes that suggested the gesture was not as casual as he wanted it to appear. "Because somebody helped me once when I needed it, and I figure it is my turn to pass it along. You do not have to tell me your story if you do not want to, and I will not ask questions. But if you need a safe place to rest for a couple of weeks, I am offering." Penelope felt something crack in her chest, some wall she had built up over the past year of running and hiding and trusting no one. This cowboy did not know her, had no reason to help her, and yet here he was, offering her the first real kindness she had been shown in longer than she could remember. She could see that he meant it, that there was no hidden agenda in his offer, and that scared her almost as much as it comforted her. "All right," she said finally, "but I will pay you back. I do not take charity." "It is not charity," Matthew said. "It is basic human decency. Come on, I will show you the cabin." The cabin was indeed small, but it was clean and well maintained, with whitewashed walls and a floor made of smooth wooden planks. There was a narrow bed pushed against one wall, a cast iron stove in the corner, a small table with 2 chairs, and a washstand with a basin and pitcher. To Penelope's exhausted eyes, it looked like a palace. "I will bring over some firewood and get the stove going," Matthew said. "And I will fetch some water for the basin. There is soap in the dish there and some towels in the trunk at the foot of the bed. They are clean." Penelope nodded, not trusting herself to speak because she could feel tears threatening again, and she did not want to break down in front of this stranger who was showing her more kindness than her own family had. Matthew seemed to understand because he simply nodded back and left, closing the door quietly behind him. Alone for the first time in days in a space that actually had walls and a door that locked, Penelope sank down onto the bed and felt her body go weak with relief. The mattress was thin, and the tick was stuffed with straw rather than feathers, but it was softer than anything she had felt in 372 days, and when she pressed her hand against it, she felt something in her chest release. She had not cried in months because crying was a luxury she could not afford, but now, in this small cabin with a locked door between her and the world, she let herself weep. The tears came hard and fast, a year's worth of fear and exhaustion and loneliness pouring out of her in great, shaking sobs. She cried for her parents, dead and buried in Missouri soil. She cried for the life she had lost, for the friends she had left behind, for the woman she had been before she learned that the people who were supposed to protect her could be the most dangerous of all. She cried until there were no tears left, until her eyes were swollen and her throat was raw. And then she lay there on that thin mattress, feeling emptied out and strangely lighter for it. A knock on the door made her sit up quickly, her hand moving instinctively toward her pistol before she remembered where she was. "Yes," she called out, her voice rough. "Brought the firewood and water." Matthew's voice came through the door. "I will leave it on the step." Penelope waited until she heard his footsteps retreat before she opened the door and brought in the supplies. True to his word, there was an armload of chopped wood and a full pitcher of water, and beside them, wrapped in a clean cloth, was a plate of food: bread, cheese, and cold chicken. There was no note, no expectation of thanks, just the food and the supplies, and Penelope felt that crack in her chest widen a little more. She ate slowly, forcing herself not to gulp the food even though her stomach was growling with hunger. The bread was fresh, the cheese sharp and good, and the chicken was better than anything she had eaten in months. When she was done, she heated water on the stove and washed herself thoroughly, scrubbing away the grime and sweat until her skin felt raw and clean. She washed her hair too, working her fingers through the tangles until it was smooth and wet down her back. There were no clean clothes to change into, so she washed out her undergarments and draped them over a chair near the stove to dry, then wrapped herself in one of the towels from the trunk and sat on the edge of the bed, combing out her hair with her fingers. The simple domestic act felt strange after so long on the run, and she found herself thinking about Matthew Kincaid, the cowboy who had given up his bed for a stranger without asking anything in return. She wondered what his story was, what had brought him to El Dorado, and why he ran a livery stable instead of working cattle like most cowboys. She wondered if he was married, though she had seen no evidence of a woman's presence in the cabin. She wondered if he was lonely, if he lay awake at night thinking about the life he might have had if circumstances had been different. And then she wondered why she was thinking about him at all, when she should be focused on resting and recovering and planning her next move. But as she lay down on the mattress, her damp hair spread across the pillow, she could not stop thinking about the quiet kindness in Matthew's eyes, the gentle way he had tended to her exhausted mare, the fact that he was sleeping in his own stable so that she could have a safe place to rest. She had not trusted anyone in so long that she had forgotten what it felt like to be cared for, even in such a small way, and the feeling was both wonderful and terrifying. Sleep claimed her quickly, pulling her down into darkness so complete that she did not dream at all. Penelope woke to bright sunlight streaming through the cabin's single window and the sound of horses moving about in the stable yard. For a moment, she was disoriented, her hand reaching for the pistol she kept close while sleeping, her body tensing for flight. Then she remembered where she was, remembered the cowboy named Matthew Kincaid and his unexpected kindness, and she let herself relax back into the mattress. She had slept through the entire night without waking once, something she had not done since before she started running. Her body felt heavy and slow, and she realized with a start that she must have been more exhausted than she had known. The sun's position suggested it was mid-morning, which meant she had slept for nearly 15 hours straight. Her undergarments were dry by the stove, and she dressed quickly, pulling on the same dusty dress she had worn the day before because it was all she had. She longed for clean clothes, for a proper dress that was not stained and worn, but that was another luxury she could not afford. She braided her hair, washed her face, and then stepped outside to see what the new day would bring. The stable yard was busy with activity. A wagon was pulled up near the main building, and she could see Matthew helping a farmer load sacks of feed into the back. There were several horses in the corral, and a young boy of perhaps 12 was mucking out stalls. Everything spoke of a thriving business, well-run and prosperous, and Penelope felt a pang of something she could not quite name as she watched Matthew work. He saw her, and raised a hand in greeting but did not stop what he was doing. Penelope appreciated that he was not making a fuss over her presence, was not drawing attention to her or treating her like a curiosity. She moved toward the stable, wanting to check on her mare, and found the horse standing in her stall, looking considerably better than she had the previous evening. The animal had been brushed, her mane and tail combed out, and there was fresh water and hay in abundance. "She looks better this morning," Matthew's voice came from behind her, and Penelope turned to find him standing a few feet away, his hat pushed back on his head and a slight smile on his face. "Ate well last night and drank plenty. I think she is going to be just fine with some rest." "Thank you," Penelope said, meaning it for more than just the care of her horse. "For everything." Matthew shrugged, that same casual gesture she was beginning to recognize. "Like I said, no need for thanks. You settling in all right in the cabin?" "I slept better than I have in a year," Penelope admitted before she could stop herself. Something shifted in Matthew's expression, a shadow of understanding passing through his eyes. "Good," he said simply. "That is good." They stood there for a moment in comfortable silence, and Penelope found herself studying him in the morning light. He had a good face, she decided, strong-featured and honest, with lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled more often than he frowned. There was a scar on his chin, partially hidden by the stubble on his jaw, and she found herself wondering how he had gotten it. "I should let you get back to work," she said, because she did not know what else to say, and the silence was beginning to feel weighted with something she could not name. "I was going to take a break for lunch in a bit," Matthew said, and there was something almost hesitant in his voice. "There is a decent restaurant in town if you would like to get a real meal. My treat, before you say no." Penelope's first instinct was to refuse, to retreat back to the safety of the cabin and avoid any more interaction than necessary. But she was hungry, and the thought of a hot meal that she did not have to cook herself was tempting. More than that, though, she found that she wanted to spend more time with this cowboy who had shown her such unexpected kindness. "All right," she said, "but I pay for my own meal." Matthew looked like he wanted to argue, but he simply nodded. "Fair enough. Give me an hour to finish up here, and I will come get you." The restaurant was a small establishment on the main street called the Frontier Cafe, and it was surprisingly clean and welcoming. The proprietor, a plump woman with graying hair and a warm smile, greeted Matthew by name and showed them to a table near the window. Penelope saw the woman's eyes linger on her curiously, no doubt wondering who this strange, worn-looking woman was and what her connection to Matthew might be, but she was too polite to ask directly. They ordered steak and potatoes and coffee, and while they waited for their food, Matthew told her about El Dorado. The town had been founded in 1857, he explained, and had grown steadily with the arrival of the railroad in the 1870s. It was a cow town primarily, with cattle drives coming through regularly during the season, but it also had farmers and merchants and even a small schoolhouse. "It is a good place," Matthew said, stirring sugar into his coffee. "People here mostly mind their own business, but they will help out when help is needed. I have been here 6 months, and it already feels more like home than anywhere I have been in a long time." "Where are you from originally?" Penelope asked, genuinely curious. "Texas," Matthew said. "Near San Antonio. Worked cattle ranches most of my life until I decided I wanted something different, saved up enough to buy the livery stable here, and I have been building it up ever since." "You miss it, working cattle?" Matthew considered the question, his eyes distant. "Sometimes. There is something about being out on the range with nothing but the sky and the land and the herd. But I like what I am doing now, too. I like putting down roots, building something that is mine." Penelope heard the longing in his voice, the desire for stability and home, and she felt an ache in her chest because she wanted those things too. She had wanted them for a year now, had dreamed of finding a place where she could stop running, could build a life that was truly hers. But she did not know if that would ever be possible. Not while her uncle was still looking for her. Not while there was still a chance that she could be dragged back to Missouri and lose everything. Their food arrived, and they ate in companionable silence for a while. The steak was tender and perfectly cooked, and Penelope savored every bite, knowing that this might be the best meal she had in weeks or months once she moved on from El Dorado. But even as she thought about leaving, she felt a reluctance that surprised her. She had only been here one day, had only known Matthew Kincaid for a handful of hours, and yet already she could feel herself wanting to stay. "Can I ask you something?" Matthew said after they had finished eating and were lingering over second cups of coffee. "You can ask," Penelope said carefully. "I might not answer." "Fair enough." Matthew turned his coffee cup slowly in his hands, his expression thoughtful. "Are you running from the law?" The direct question caught Penelope off guard, and for a moment she did not know how to respond. "No," she said finally, deciding that honesty was the least she could offer this man who had helped her. "I am not a criminal, if that is what you are asking." "That is what I am asking," Matthew said, and there was relief in his voice. "And I believe you. But I am guessing whoever you are running from, they mean you harm." It was not a question, but Penelope answered anyway. "Yes." Matthew nodded slowly. "Then I am glad you are here where you can rest and recover. And I want you to know that if anyone comes around asking questions about strangers in town, I will not say anything about you." The offer of protection, however small, made Penelope's throat tighten with emotion. "Why are you doing this?" she asked for the second time since meeting him. "You do not know me. You have no reason to help me." "Maybe I do not need a reason," Matthew said, meeting her eyes across the table. "Or maybe the reason is that I can see you are in trouble and you need help and I happen to be in a position to give it. Does it really matter why?" Penelope thought about that, about the kindness of strangers and the unexpected ways people could change your life. "I suppose not," she said quietly. "But I want you to know that I appreciate it, more than I can say." They walked back to the stable together, and Penelope found herself acutely aware of Matthew's presence beside her. The way he unconsciously adjusted his stride to match hers, the way he tipped his hat to the ladies they passed on the street. He was well liked in town, she realized, respected and trusted, and she wondered what people would think if they knew he was harboring a fugitive in his cabin. But she was not truly a fugitive, she reminded herself. She had broken no laws, committed no crimes. She had simply refused to be sold into marriage like a piece of property, had chosen freedom and uncertainty over security and subjugation. That should not make her a criminal, but she knew that in the eyes of the law, a woman's property and person belonged to her male relatives until she married, and by running away, she had stolen what was rightfully her uncle's to control. The thought made her angry all over again, the injustice of it burning in her chest like live coals. She had lost her parents, lost her home, lost a year of her life to running and hiding, all because her uncle was greedy, and the law saw nothing wrong with forcing a woman to marry against her will. It was not right, would never be right, and she hated that there was nothing she could do about it except keep running. The days that followed fell into an unexpected rhythm. Penelope helped around the stable in small ways, mucking out stalls and filling water buckets and brushing down horses, partly to earn her keep and partly because having work to do made her feel less useless. Matthew protested at first, saying she was supposed to be resting, but she insisted, and eventually he relented. They talked while they worked, cautious conversations at first that gradually became deeper and more personal. Matthew told her about growing up on a ranch in Texas, about losing his parents to cholera when he was 20, about working cattle drives for 5 years to save enough money to buy his own place. Penelope found herself telling him about her parents, about the farm in Missouri, and how happy she had been before the fire took everything away. She did not tell him about her uncle or the forced marriage or the men who were hunting for her. That still felt too dangerous, too raw, and besides, Matthew had said he would not ask questions, and he kept his word. But she could see the curiosity in his eyes sometimes, the unspoken questions he held back out of respect for her privacy. At night, Penelope slept in the cabin while Matthew bedded down in the stable loft, and every morning she woke feeling more rested, more like herself than she had in months. The constant vigilance that had become second nature began to relax, just a little, and she started to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could be safe here, at least for a little while. A week passed, then another day. Penelope's mare continued to improve, growing stronger and more spirited with rest and good care. Penelope knew that soon the horse would be ready to travel, and she would have to make a decision about where to go next. The thought filled her with a dread she had not expected, because leaving meant saying goodbye to the first piece she had known in a year, meant saying goodbye to Matthew. She tried not to think about that, tried to focus on the practical concerns of money and supplies, and where she might go that would be safe. But her thoughts kept returning to the cowboy with the kind eyes and quiet strength, to the way he made her feel seen and valued without demanding anything in return. She was falling for him, she realized, with a mixture of wonder and terror. Despite her best efforts to keep her heart locked away, despite knowing that attachment was dangerous and trust was a luxury she could not afford, she was falling in love with Matthew Kincaid. The realization came to her one evening as they sat on the steps of the cabin together, watching the sun set over the Kansas plains. The sky was on fire with color, brilliant oranges and deep purples and gold that seemed to set the clouds ablaze, and Matthew was telling her a story about a particularly stubborn bull he had once worked with in Texas. Penelope was only half listening to the words because she was too busy watching his face, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the way his hands moved expressively as he talked, the way being near him made her feel safe in a way she had not felt since before her parents died. She loved him. The knowledge settled into her heart with a certainty that was both exhilarating and terrifying. She loved this cowboy who had given up his bed for a stranger, who asked no questions and demanded nothing, who treated her with a respect and kindness she had thought no longer existed in the world. And she had no idea what to do about it because loving someone meant trusting them with your heart, and Penelope had forgotten how to trust. "You are quiet tonight," Matthew observed, his story trailing off as he turned to look at her. "Something on your mind?" "Just thinking," Penelope said, which was true enough. About leaving, the question was asked gently, without accusation, but Penelope heard the underlying sadness in it and realized that Matthew was not ready for her to go either. The thought made her brave in a way she had not been in a long time. "What if I did not want to leave?" she asked, the words coming out before she could stop them. Matthew was very still beside her. "What are you saying?" "I am saying that I am tired of running," Penelope said, turning to face him fully. "I am tired of being alone and scared and never staying anywhere long enough to have a life. I am saying that these past 8 days here with you have been the best days I have had in over a year, and the thought of leaving makes me feel like I am tearing out a piece of myself." "Penelope," Matthew said, and her name on his lips sounded like a prayer and a question all at once. "I know it is foolish," she continued, the words tumbling out now that she had started. "I know you barely know me, and I barely know you, and there are things about my past that I have not told you. But I also know that I feel safe here with you in a way I have not felt safe since my parents died. And I think maybe you feel something for me too, or I hope you do, because I am falling in love with you, Matthew Kincaid, and I do not know what to do about it." The silence that followed her confession seemed to stretch for an eternity. Penelope could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears, could feel the heat of embarrassment creeping up her neck, could taste fear and hope in equal measure. She had just laid her heart bare before this cowboy, had given him the power to hurt her in ways that her uncle's hired men never could, and she did not know if she had made the biggest mistake of her life or the bravest decision. Then Matthew reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers wrapping around hers with a gentleness that made her breath catch. "I have been half in love with you since you walked into my stable 8 days ago," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Watching you sleep in my cabin at night, knowing you are safe and warm, that has meant more to me than I can put into words. And working beside you during the days, learning who you are, seeing your strength and courage, that has just made me fall harder." "Matthew," Penelope whispered, tears pricking at her eyes. "I do not need to know all your secrets," Matthew continued. "I do not need to know why you are running or who you are running from. What I need is for you to know that if you want to stay, if you want to build a life here in El Dorado, then I want to build it with you. I want to wake up every morning knowing you are here, knowing you are mine and I am yours. I want to give you the home and the safety you have been looking for." "But you do not know what you are offering," Penelope said, needing him to understand. "The people looking for me, they might find me eventually, and if they do, there could be trouble. Legal trouble may be worse. I cannot ask you to take that risk." "You are not asking," Matthew said firmly. "I am offering, and I have dealt with trouble before. I'm not scared of whatever or whoever is chasing you, but I am scared of letting you go, of watching you ride out of here and spending the rest of my life wondering what might have been if I had been brave enough to ask you to stay." Penelope felt the tears spill over, running down her cheeks unchecked. "I want to stay," she said. "God help me, I want to stay so badly." "Then stay," Matthew said, and he lifted his free hand to cup her face, his thumb brushing away her tears with infinite tenderness. "Stay and let me take care of you. Stay and let me love you the way you deserve to be loved. Stay and build a life with me here." "Yes," Penelope breathed. "Yes, I will stay." Matthew kissed her then, a soft, sweet kiss that tasted of promises and hope and new beginnings. Penelope leaned into him, her hands coming up to grip his shoulders, and for the first time in a year, she felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The past did not matter, the future could wait, and all that mattered was this moment, this man, this feeling of finally coming home. They sat on those steps until the stars came out, talking about everything and nothing, making plans for a future that suddenly seemed possible. Matthew told her about the land he wanted to buy on the edge of town, about the house he wanted to build there someday. Penelope told him about her love of reading, about how she had once dreamed of becoming a teacher. They talked about children, about whether they wanted them and how many, and Penelope felt a joy she had not known she could still feel bubbling up in her chest. It was late when they finally stood to go their separate ways for the night, and Penelope felt a reluctance to part from Matthew even for the few hours until morning. But propriety still mattered, even here on the edge of civilization, and she knew that they needed to do things right if they were going to build a life together. "I will see you in the morning," Matthew said, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Sleep well, Penelope." "You too," she said. "And Matthew, thank you for everything." He smiled, that slow, warm smile that made her heart skip a beat. "Nothing to thank me for. You are worth it, Penelope Dawson, never doubt that." The use of her full name startled her, because she had never told him her surname. But then she realized that she must have mentioned it at some point without thinking about it. Or maybe he had simply guessed, had put together pieces from their conversations. Either way, It did not matter because Matthew, knowing her name, her real name, felt right in a way nothing had felt right in a long time. The next morning, Penelope woke with a sense of purpose she had not felt in months. She was going to stay in Dorado. She was going to build a life here with Matthew. And that meant she needed to stop hiding, needed to start facing her past instead of running from it. The thought was terrifying, but it was also liberating because she was tired of being afraid, tired of looking over her shoulder, tired of letting her uncle's greed control her life. She found Matthew in the stable, already at work despite the early hour, and he looked up at her approach with a smile that made her stomach flip pleasantly. "Morning," he said. "You are up early." "I have been thinking," Penelope said, "about my situation, about why I was running." Matthew set down the bucket he had been carrying and gave her his full attention. "All right." Penelope took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "A year ago, my parents died in a fire that destroyed our farm in Missouri. They left me the land, about 300 acres of good farmland along the river. My uncle was appointed my guardian, and at first, I thought he was trying to help me. But then I realized that he wanted control of the land, and the only way he could get it legally was if I married his business partner, a man twice my age who had already buried 2 wives. Matthew's expression darkened. "So you ran?" "I ran the night before the wedding," Penelope confirmed. "I took my horse and what money I could grab and I disappeared. My uncle hired men to find me, to bring me back. I have been running ever since, never staying anywhere long enough for them to catch up." "How old are you?" Matthew asked. 23. I will be 24 in October." "Then you are legally of age in most states," Matthew said thoughtfully. "Your uncle's guardianship should not hold any legal weight anymore." "Maybe not, but the marriage contract was signed by him as my guardian before I turned 21. I do not know if running away voided it, or if I am still considered promised to that man. And even if the contract is not valid, my uncle has money and influence. He could make my life very difficult if he found me." Matthew was quiet for a moment, his jaw set in a way that suggested he was thinking hard. "What is your uncle's name?" Harold Donnelly. "He owns a freight company in St. Louis. And the man you were supposed to marry, Thomas Whitmore. He owns several dry goods stores throughout Missouri." Matthew nodded slowly. "All right, here is what we are going to do. Dorado has a lawyer, a good man named Benjamin Parker. We are going to go see him today and explain your situation. He can look into the legality of that marriage contract and help us figure out what your options are. If your uncle's guardianship is no longer valid, then you are a free woman with legal claim to your land." "But even if I have legal claim, I cannot go back to Missouri," Penelope protested. "My uncle would never let me take possession of the farm." "Maybe not," Matthew agreed. "But you could sell it, or lease it. That land is your inheritance, Penelope, and you deserve to benefit from it instead of spending your life running because you are afraid to claim what is rightfully yours." Hope flickered in Penelope's chest, cautious and fragile. "Do you really think it could work?" "I think it is worth trying," Matthew said. "And I think that if we are going to build a life together, we need to deal with this properly instead of waiting for your past to catch up with you. You said you were tired of running. So let's stop running and start fighting back." The lawyer, Benjamin Parker, turned out to be a middle-aged man with wire-rimmed spectacles and an air of competent professionalism. His office was above the general store, a small space lined with law books and smelling of paper and ink. He listened intently as Penelope told her story, interrupting occasionally to ask clarifying questions, and when she was done, he sat back in his chair and steepled his fingers. "You have been through quite an ordeal, Miss Dawson," he said sympathetically, "but I think Mr. Kincaid is right. You have legal options here that you should explore. First and foremost, you are 23 years old, which means any guardianship your uncle held over you expired when you turned 21. That includes any legal authority he had to arrange your marriage. So the marriage contract is not valid? Penelope asked, hardly daring to hope. It depends on the specific wording of the contract and the laws of Missouri, Parker said. But in general, a guardianship contract signed on behalf of a minor becomes void when that minor reaches legal age. You would have had to sign new paperwork, consenting to the marriage once you turned 21, and obviously you did not do that. Relief flooded through Penelope so intensely that she felt dizzy with it. So I am free. I do not have to marry Thomas Whitmore. Not based on any contract your uncle signed, no, Parker confirmed. As for your land, that is a bit more complicated. If your parents left it to you in a will, then it is legally yours and has been since their death. However, if your uncle has been managing it as your guardian, he may have been collecting rents or income from it, which would legally belong to you. I had not even thought about that, Penelope admitted. I would recommend that you write to the county clerk in Missouri, where the land is located, and request copies of your parents' will and any property records related to the farm, Parker said. Once we have that documentation, we can determine exactly what your legal position is and what steps need to be taken to secure your ownership. If necessary, we can file suit against your uncle for any misappropriation of funds. The idea of taking legal action against her uncle was both satisfying and terrifying. Would I have to go back to Missouri for that? Possibly, depending on where any lawsuit would be filed, Parker said. But that is getting ahead of ourselves. First, let's get the documentation and see exactly what we are dealing with. In the meantime, you are safe here in Kansas. If your uncle or anyone acting on his behalf tries to force you to return to Missouri against your will, that would be kidnapping, which is a federal offense. Penelope felt Matthew's hand find hers under the table, his fingers lacing through hers in silent support. "Thank you, Mr. Parker," she said. "I appreciate your help." "Happy to provide it, Miss Dawson," Parker said with a kind smile. "And please call me Benjamin." "Now, let's start drafting those letters, shall we?" Over the next few weeks, Penelope began to build a real life in El Dorado. She moved out of Matthew's cabin and took a room at the boarding house run by Mrs. Eleanor Montgomery, a formidable widow who took an immediate liking to Penelope and treated her like a daughter. It was important, Matthew had insisted, that they observe propriety if they were going to court properly, and Penelope had agreed, even though part of her missed the quiet intimacy of those evenings on the cabin steps. But they saw each other every day, and their courtship blossomed in the golden Kansas summer. Matthew took her on picnics out on the prairie, where they would sit on a blanket and watch the clouds drift by while talking about their hopes and dreams. He taught her to ride properly, not the desperate flight she had been doing for the past year, but real riding for the pleasure of it. And in the evenings, they would sit on Mrs. Montgomery's porch, holding hands and stealing kisses when the landlady was not looking. The letters to Missouri went out, carefully worded requests for information that Benjamin Parker had helped compose. And then they waited, knowing that it would take weeks or possibly months for responses to come back. In the meantime, Penelope found work helping at the schoolhouse, assisting the teacher with the younger children, and she discovered a joy in teaching that made her feel useful and fulfilled in ways she had not felt in a long time. Matthew's livery business continued to thrive, and he began making plans to buy that land he had talked about, the plot on the edge of town where he wanted to build a house. He took Penelope to see it one Sunday afternoon, and they walked the property together, imagining where the house would sit, where the barn would go, where they might plant a garden. "I want to marry you," Matthew said suddenly, stopping in the middle of the field and turning to face her. "I know we have only known each other for a couple of months, and maybe that seems fast, but I have never been more sure of anything in my life. I love you, Penelope Dawson, and I want to spend the rest of my life with you." Penelope felt tears spring to her eyes, happy tears this time. "I love you too," she said. "And yes, I want to marry you, but I think we should wait until we hear back from Missouri, until we know for certain that I am truly free." "That is probably wise," Matthew agreed, though she could see the disappointment in his eyes. "But that does not mean I cannot give you this." He pulled a small box from his pocket and opened it to reveal a simple gold band with a small diamond set in the center. It was not extravagant or fancy, but it was beautiful, and Penelope gasped when she saw it. "It was my mother's," Matthew said quietly. "The only thing of hers I kept after she died. I want you to have it as a promise. When the time is right, when we have sorted out all the legal mess with your uncle, I am going to marry you proper. But until then, I want you to wear this and know that you are mine and I am yours." Penelope held out her hand, and Matthew slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her, and she looked at it through the blur of tears, feeling overwhelmed by the depth of Matthew's love and commitment. "I will treasure it," she whispered, "and I will treasure you." They kissed there in the middle of that empty field, with the Kansas wind blowing around them and the sun warm on their faces. And Penelope knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The responses from Missouri began arriving in late September, nearly 2 months after Penelope had sent her inquiries. Benjamin Parker called her and Matthew to his office to go over the documents together, and what they learned was both encouraging and infuriating. Penelope's parents had indeed left the farm to her in a properly executed will, with her uncle named as trustee until she reached the age of 21. Once she turned 21, the property should have been transferred directly to her control, but according to the county records, her uncle had continued to manage it and collect rents from it. Over the past 2 years, he had collected nearly $3,000 in rental income that rightfully belonged to Penelope. "This is clear misappropriation," Benjamin said, his expression grim. "Your uncle has been stealing from you, Miss Dawson, and he has been doing so in direct violation of your parents' will." "Can we get the money back?" Penelope asked. "We can certainly try," Benjamin said. "I will draft a formal letter to your uncle demanding that he cease managing the property immediately and remit all funds owed to you. If he refuses, we can file suit in Missouri civil court." "He will refuse," Penelope said with certainty. "He did not go to all the trouble of trying to force me into marriage just to give up the land without a fight." "Then we will fight him in court," Matthew said firmly, his hand finding Penelope's. "And we will win because the law is on our side." Benjamin sent the letter, and they waited again. 3 weeks later, a response arrived, but it was not from Penelope's uncle. Instead, it was from a lawyer representing Thomas Whitmore, the man Penelope had been promised to marry. The letter was coldly formal and stated that Mr. Whitmore still considered the marriage contract valid and binding, and that he expected Miss Dawson to honor her commitments or face legal consequences. "This is ridiculous," Matthew said angrily, when Benjamin read the letter aloud. "She never signed any contract. Her uncle signed it when she was a minor, and it has no legal standing now that she is of age." "You and I know that," Benjamin said calmly, "but Mr. Whitmore is apparently hoping to intimidate Miss Dawson into complying. This is a bluff, nothing more. He has no legal grounds to force her into marriage." "So what do we do?" Penelope asked, trying to keep her voice steady even though her heart was pounding with anxiety. "We call his bluff," Benjamin said. "I will send a response explaining that you are 23 years old and under no obligation to honor any contract signed on your behalf while you were a minor. And I will make it clear that any further attempts to coerce or intimidate you will be met with legal action." Another letter went out, and this time the response came quickly. Harold Donnelly himself wrote back, and his letter was venomous in its anger. He accused Penelope of being ungrateful and disloyal, of dishonoring her parents' memory, of bringing shame on the family name. He claimed that she owed him for the years he had spent managing her affairs, and that if she wanted the farm, she would have to buy it from him at fair market value. "He is claiming ownership," Penelope asked incredulously. "How can he claim ownership of land my parents left to me?" "He cannot legally," Benjamin said, "but he is clearly hoping to tie this up in court long enough that you will give up or run out of money for legal fees. It is a common tactic among unscrupulous individuals." "So we go to court," Matthew said. "Going to court in Missouri could be difficult and expensive," Benjamin warned. "You would both need to travel there, and there is no guarantee how long the case would take to resolve. Months, possibly years." Penelope felt despair settle over her like a heavy blanket. She had finally found happiness, had finally found a home and a man who loved her, and now her uncle was threatening to drag her back into the nightmare she had been trying to escape. "Maybe I should just let him have the land," she said quietly. "Maybe it is not worth the fight." "No," Matthew said fiercely. "That land is yours, Penelope. Your parents left it to you, and you have every right to it. We are not letting your uncle steal it just because fighting back is hard." "But the cost," Penelope protested. "I have money saved," Matthew said. "And if we need more, we will borrow it. This is not just about the land, Penelope. This is about standing up for what is right. Your uncle has spent the past year terrorizing you, forcing you to run and hide and live in fear. It is time to stop letting him win." Penelope looked at Matthew, at the determination in his eyes, and felt something shift inside her. He was right. She had been running for so long that she had forgotten how to fight, had let fear dictate every decision she made. But she was not alone anymore. She had Matthew, and she had Benjamin Parker, and she had the law on her side. Maybe it was time to stop running and start standing her ground. "All right," she said, lifting her chin. "We fight. Whatever it takes, we fight." Benjamin Parker began preparing a lawsuit against Harold Donnelly. And in November, Penelope and Matthew made the long journey to Missouri. They traveled by train, arriving in St. Louis on a gray, cold day that matched Penelope's mood. She had not been back to Missouri since she fled a year ago, and being here made her feel exposed and vulnerable in ways she had not felt since leaving El Dorado. But Matthew was beside her, solid and steady, and that gave her courage. They checked into a hotel and met with a local lawyer that Benjamin had recommended, a man named Joseph Crane who specialized in property disputes. Joseph reviewed the case and agreed to represent Penelope in Missouri court. The lawsuit was filed the next day, formally accusing Harold Donnelly of misappropriating funds and illegally retaining control of property that rightfully belonged to Penelope Dawson. A court date was set for January, 2 months away, and Penelope and Matthew returned to El Dorado to wait once more. Christmas came, and Penelope spent it with Matthew and Mrs. Montgomery and some of the other friends she had made in El Dorado. It was a quiet, joyful celebration, so different from the lonely, frightened Christmas she had spent the previous year hiding in a cave in Colorado. She and Matthew exchanged gifts. She gave him a new leather belt she had tooled herself, learning the craft from the town's saddle maker, and he gave her a beautiful shawl in deep blue wool that brought out the color of her eyes. They attended Christmas service at the small church in town, and Penelope found herself praying for the first time in months, asking for strength and justice, and the courage to face whatever lay ahead. She felt Matthew's hand in hers, warm and strong, and knew that whatever happened, she would not face it alone. In January, they traveled back to Missouri for the trial. The courthouse was an imposing brick building in St. Louis, and Penelope felt her stomach twist with nerves as they climbed the steps to the courtroom. Inside, she saw her uncle for the first time in over a year, and the hatred in his eyes when he looked at her was palpable. The trial lasted 3 days. Joseph Crane presented the will, the property records, and documentation of the rental income Harold had collected. He called witnesses who testified to Penelope's identity and her parents' clear intention that the farm be left to their daughter. Harold's lawyer tried to argue that Harold had acted in good faith as Penelope's guardian, and that any income collected had been used for her benefit. But when pressed for records of how the money had been spent, he could produce nothing. On the 3rd day, the judge, a stern-faced man named Jeremiah Holt, called for closing arguments. Joseph Crane stood and spoke passionately about the rights of inheritance and the duty of guardians to act in the best interests of their wards. Harold's lawyer countered that Penelope had abandoned her family and had no right to claim property she had shown no interest in managing. Then, it was time for the judge's decision. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Holt reviewed his notes, and Penelope felt Matthew's hand grip her so tightly it almost hurt. She held her breath, waiting, praying, hoping. "It is the judgment of this court," Judge Holt said finally, his voice ringing through the courtroom, "that the property known as the Dawson Farm, consisting of 300 acres in Madison County, Missouri, is the sole and rightful property of Miss Penelope Dawson, as clearly stated in the will of her parents, Jacob and Martha Dawson. Furthermore, the court finds that Harold Donnelly did unlawfully retain control of said property beyond the termination of his guardianship, and did collect rental income totaling $2,940 that rightfully belongs to Miss Dawson. Mr. Donnelly is hereby ordered to remit said funds to Miss Dawson within 30 days, with interest. Ownership of the property is to be transferred to Miss Dawson immediately." The gavel came down, and Penelope felt tears of relief stream down her face. They had won. After everything, after a year of running and hiding and fighting, she had won. The farm was hers, and her uncle could never threaten her again. Harold Donnelly stormed out of the courtroom without a word, his face purple with rage, but Penelope barely noticed. She was too busy being swept up in Matthew's arms, held tight against his chest as he whispered over and over that she was free. She was safe. She had won. They left Missouri the next day, taking the train back to Kansas with lighter hearts and the legal documents proving Penelope's ownership of the farm safely tucked away. On the journey home, they talked about what to do with the property. Penelope had no desire to return to Missouri to live, not after everything that had happened, so they decided to lease the farm to a tenant farmer, ensuring that Penelope would have a steady income while keeping the land in her name. "I want to use some of the money to help you buy that land in Dorado," Penelope said as they watched the Kansas plains roll by outside the train window. "For our house, for our future." "That is your money, Penelope," Matthew protested. "Your inheritance." "And I want to use it to build a life with you," Penelope said firmly. "We are going to be married, Matthew. What is mine is yours, and what is yours is mine. That is what marriage means." Matthew smiled, that slow, warm smile she loved so much. Then I guess we should probably make that marriage official, do you not think? I think that would be an excellent idea, Penelope agreed, her heart soaring with happiness. They were married in March in the little church in El Dorado with Mrs. Montgomery and Benjamin Parker and half the town in attendance. Penelope wore a new dress of pale blue silk that she had ordered from the seamstress, and Matthew wore a new suit that made him look so handsome she could barely breathe when she saw him waiting for her at the altar. The ceremony was simple and heartfelt, and when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Matthew kissed her with such joy and love that Penelope felt like her heart would burst. They celebrated with a reception at the hotel, with food and music and dancing, and Penelope could not remember ever being so happy. That night, in the small house Matthew had built on the land they now owned together, Penelope lay in her husband's arms and marveled at how much her life had changed. A year and a half ago she had been running for her life, sleeping on hard ground without hope or peace. Now she was safe, loved, and surrounded by friends in a town she could call home. "I never thought I would have this," she whispered into the darkness. "I never thought I would be this happy." "Neither did I," Matthew admitted, pressing a kiss to her hair. "But I am grateful every day that you walked into my stable. I am grateful that you gave me your bed," Penelope said with a soft laugh. "I had not felt a real mattress in a year. I think that was the moment I started falling in love with you, even though I did not realize it at the time." "Best decision I ever made," Matthew said, his arms tightening around her. "Sleeping outside for a few weeks was a small price to pay for a lifetime with you." They built a good life together in El Dorado. Matthew's livery business continued to thrive, and Penelope took a position as the assistant teacher at the schoolhouse, finding joy and purpose in helping educate the town's children. The rental income from the Missouri farm provided them with financial security, and they were able to expand their house, adding rooms and a proper barn, and even a small workshop where Matthew could do leatherwork in his spare time. Their first child was born in the spring of 1884, a healthy boy they named Jacob after Penelope's father. He had Matthew's dark hair and Penelope's green eyes, and from the moment he was born, he had both of his parents wrapped around his tiny fingers. Penelope marveled at motherhood, at the fierce love she felt for this tiny person she and Matthew had created together. 2 years later, their daughter was born, a delicate little girl with blonde hair and her father's whiskey-colored eyes. They named her Martha after Penelope's mother, and she was as spirited and independent as her namesake had been. Jacob adored his little sister, and watching her children play together filled Penelope with a contentment she had never imagined possible. Life was not without its challenges. There were hard winters when Matthew's business slowed and money was tight. There were illnesses that kept Penelope up at night, nursing sick children and praying they would recover. There were disagreements and frustrations and moments when the demands of life felt overwhelming. But through it all, Penelope and Matthew faced everything together, their love deepening and strengthening with each passing year. Penelope never heard from her uncle again. She learned through a letter from Joseph Crane that Harold Donnelly had died in 1886, leaving behind debts and a tarnished reputation. She felt no satisfaction at his death, only a sad relief that the chapter of her life he represented was finally, truly closed. She forgave him eventually, not because he deserved it, but because holding on to anger was too heavy a burden to carry. The Missouri farm continued to be leased out, providing steady income that allowed Penelope and Matthew to save for their children's future. When Jacob turned 16, they gave him the choice of whether to keep the farm or sell it, and he chose to sell, using the money to start his own business in El Dorado. Penelope was proud of her son's independence and ambition, seeing in him both her own determination and Matthew's steady work ethic. As the years passed and their children grew, Penelope often thought back to that desperate year when she had been running, sleeping on hard ground, certain that she would never know peace or happiness again. She thought about the cowboy who had given up his bed for a stranger, who had asked no questions and offered only kindness, who had loved her when she was broken and helped her become whole again. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Matthew surprised her with a trip back to the spot where he had proposed, the empty field that was no longer empty but held their house and barn, and all the physical manifestations of the life they had built together. They stood in the yard as the sun set, watching the Kansas sky turn brilliant with color, and Penelope leaned against her husband's side, feeling the solid warmth of him and the steady beat of his heart. "I would do it all again," Matthew said quietly. "Every moment, every choice, every hardship. All of it led me to you, and that makes everything worth it." "I feel the same way," Penelope said, turning to look up at him. "Even the running, even the fear, it brought me here to you, to this life, and I would not change a single thing." They kissed as the sun disappeared below the horizon. Two people who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful and lasting. And as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Penelope sent up a silent prayer of gratitude for the cowboy who had given his bed to a stranger and, in doing so, had given her back her life. The years continued to unfold with a gentle, steady rhythm that Penelope had once thought impossible. She and Matthew grew older together, their hair turning gray, their faces etched with the lines of a life well lived. They became grandparents, welcoming Jacob's children and then Martha's into their home and their hearts, passing on stories of perseverance and love to the next generation. The livery stable eventually passed to Jacob, who ran it with the same dedication his father had shown. Martha married a lawyer from Wichita and became involved in the women's suffrage movement, fighting for the rights that Penelope's own struggles had taught her were so important. Penelope was immensely proud of both her children, seeing in them the strength and courage that she and Matthew had tried to instill. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, Penelope watched the world change around her. El Dorado grew from a cattle town to a thriving city. Automobiles replaced horses on many of the streets. Electric lights illuminated homes that had once relied on candles and oil lamps. But through all the changes, the love between Penelope and Matthew remained constant, an anchor in a shifting world. They celebrated their 40th anniversary surrounded by children and grandchildren. And as Penelope looked around the table at the family they had created, she was overwhelmed with gratitude. She thought about the girl she had been, desperate and alone, sleeping under the stars because she had nowhere else to go. She thought about the kindness of a cowboy who had seen past her desperation to the woman beneath. And she thought about the courage it had taken to stop running, to trust again, to believe that happiness was possible. Matthew caught her eye across the table and smiled, and in that smile Penelope saw everything. Their first meeting in the livery stable, his offer of his bed, their courtship under the Kansas sky, their wedding, the births of their children, every joy and sorrow they had shared. It was all there, written in the lines of his face and the warmth of his gaze, a lifetime of love distilled into a single moment. That night, after everyone had gone home and the house was quiet, Penelope and Matthew sat together on the porch as they had done countless times before. The stars were brilliant overhead, the same stars that had watched over Penelope during her year of flight, and she found herself thinking about how far she had traveled, not in miles but in spirit. "You ever think about that first night?" she asked Matthew. When I showed up at your stable, exhausted and desperate, and you gave me your bed. I think about it all the time, Matthew said, his hand finding hers in the darkness. I think about how close I came to not making that offer, to just treating you like any other customer and sending you on your way. And I think about how different my life would be if I had made that choice. I think about it too, Penelope said. About how a single act of kindness changed everything. You saved my life that night, Matthew. Not just my physical life, but my spirit, my soul. You reminded me that good people still existed in the world, that trust was possible, that love was real. You saved mine too, Matthew said softly. I did not even know I needed saving, but I did. I was lonely and I was drifting, and then you walked into my life and gave me purpose and joy and a reason to build something lasting. We saved each other, Penelope. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars wheel overhead, and Penelope felt a peace so profound it brought tears to her eyes. She had lived through darkness and fear, had faced down injustice and cruelty, had fought for her rights and her freedom. But she had also known love, deep and abiding love, and that love had sustained her through every trial and triumph. I love you, she whispered into the night. I have loved you since the day you gave me your bed and asked for nothing in return. I will love you until my last breath and beyond. And I love you, Matthew replied. My brave, beautiful Penelope. You are my greatest adventure, my deepest joy, my home. They sat together on that porch until the night grew cold and the stars began to fade with the approach of dawn. And when they finally went inside, to the bed they had shared for 40 years, Penelope lay in her husband's arms and felt nothing but gratitude for the journey that had brought her here. To this man, to this life, to this perfect, hard-won happiness. The years that followed were quieter, gentler, as age slowed their steps but not their spirits. Matthew eventually retired from running the livery, content to let Jacob take over while he spent his days working in his garden and his workshop. Penelope continued teaching for as long as she was able, finally retiring at the age of 65. Her legacy written in the hundreds of students whose lives she had touched. They remained active in the community, attending church services and town meetings, hosting family dinners that grew larger with each passing year as more grandchildren, and eventually great-grandchildren joined the clan. Their love story became something of a legend in El Dorado, passed down as an example of how kindness and courage could transform lives. When Matthew fell ill in the winter of 1915, Penelope nursed him with the same fierce determination that had carried her through her year of flight. She sat by his bedside, holding his hand, telling him stories of their life together, reminding him of all the joy they had shared. And when he looked at her with eyes that had grown dim with age and illness, she saw the same love that had been there on the day they married, undimmed by time or hardship. I do not regret a single moment, Matthew whispered one evening as the sun set outside his window. Every day with you was a gift, and every day with you was a blessing, Penelope replied, her voice thick with tears. You gave me everything, Matthew. Hope, love, a home, a family. You gave me my life back. You did the same for me, Matthew said. You were my miracle, Penelope. My beautiful, brave miracle. He passed peacefully in his sleep that night, with Penelope curled beside him in the bed they had shared for more than 4 decades. And though her grief was deep and profound, she found comfort in knowing that they had loved well and completely, that they had built something beautiful and lasting, that their story would live on in their children and grandchildren. Penelope lived another 7 years after Matthew's death, years filled with family and quiet reflection. She wrote down their story, wanting future generations to know about the cowboy who had given his bed to a stranger and the love that had grown from that single act of kindness. She wanted them to understand that courage came in many forms, that kindness mattered, that love could heal even the deepest wounds. She passed in her sleep in the spring of 1922, surrounded by the family she and Matthew had created, and was laid to rest beside her husband in the Dorado cemetery. Their graves were marked with a simple headstone that read, "Matthew and Penelope Kincaid, beloved husband and wife. Their love was a light that never dimmed." But their true legacy was not in stone or words, but in the lives they had touched, the family they had built, the love they had shared. It was in the story passed down through generations of how a desperate young woman and a kind cowboy had found each other in a Kansas town in 1882. How a single act of compassion had changed two lives forever. How love could bloom even in the hardest soil and thrive for a lifetime. And somewhere in the Kansas night, where the stars still shine as bright as they did in 1882, the story continued, whispered by the wind across the prairie, a testament to the enduring power of kindness, courage, and love. The story of a woman who had not felt a real mattress in a year, and the cowboy who gave his bed and slept outside, and how that simple act had been the beginning of a love that lasted forever.